Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to our session today entitled Bridging Generational Divides, What to Know When Four Generations Share an Office. So we all know that today workplaces are comprised of four different generations of employees or more, and we're going to start digging into that a little bit with our four panelists today. I'm Stacy Grant. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Local Initiative Support Corporation's AmeriCorps programs, and I will be serving as the moderator for this session. As we get started, I want to note that we are recording this webinar and provide a few housekeeping tips. On the top right-hand side of your screen, you will see icons for the chat and Q&A features. We encourage you to use the chat feature to comment, introduce yourselves, and interact with participants throughout the session. Please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box throughout the program as they occur to you. We will address audience questions immediately following this session in an interactive Zoom room. In that Zoom discussion room, each participant will be able to use their video and audio to interact with the panelists and other attendees. So with that said, I want to also make sure that we set some sort of leave behinds that we want all of you as attendees to leave our session with. We really want to dig deeper into today an understanding of what age diversity is and why it's important, that we understand what the generations in the workplace are, key characteristics of those generations, and really acknowledge that not everyone within their generation, and I really want to use air quotes, will share those same characteristics or values. Our goal here is not to stereotype, but to really understand and see how that level of understanding can play out in our workplace policies, practices, norms, that our CDFI colleagues can adapt and accommodate in different ways to work with our employees across generations. So with that said, I want to take an opportunity to introduce everyone to the panelists. And by way of introduction, I'm hoping that my esteemed colleagues, Marcy, Emmy, and Tracy will share with us who you are, what organization you work with, a little bit of background about yourself, but then also answer the question for me, how do you see yourself in the generational landscape? Tell us a little bit about how you identify in the context of today's session. And I'm going to ask Marcy to start.
Thanks, Stacy. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a vice president at the nonprofit Co-Generate, and our mission is actually to bridge generational divides, and we work with leaders who are working on cross-generational initiatives to solve big social problems. So I think about this generational stuff probably more than the average person. I come to this work as I was a journalist immediately before, and the part of our work that I tend to lead is our narrative change work. And when I say narrative change, there is this narrative out there that there is great generational tension, but we also see great efforts by people of different generations who want to work together. And we are interested in uplifting those and amplifying those kinds of narratives. I am a proud member of Gen X. We are like the middle child. And as a Gen Xer, we sit between the baby boomers and the millennials. And I kind of understand both of those groups quite well. I tend to have a lot of millennial characteristics. I love technology. I'm kind of, for better or worse, I got in on social media kind of early, and I feel like as a journalist, that was pretty important to me. So communication style wise, I very much identify with a lot of the millennials, and also the way in which a lot of work norms have changed intrigue me from the millennial perspective. So I'll stop there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emmy Reyes, and I'm the Executive Director of the Latino Economic Development Center of Washington, D.C. We're a CDFI headquartered in D.C. with operations in D.C., Maryland, Virginia, as well as Puerto Rico. And I have been Executive Director of LEDC for a year now. And so when we think about sort of our generation or where I identify, I am a relatively new CEO, right? I've been in this position for 1 year and identify as a millennial. And I think that one of the things that I find fortunate is this is very common within Latino culture, but I live in a 4-generation home, right? I have my grandmother, my mother, myself, and a younger niece. And so in that vein, I live and work in a multi-generational environment and able to sort of understand where everyone's coming from. And I also think a millennial raised by a boomer who, but at the same time, also raised by my grandmother, who's more from the silent generation. It's really seeing the differences in all of those things. And at the same time, the influence that various art forms like television things have in the perceptions that different generations have in terms of how we live and work. And so excited to be here and learn more from all of you.
Good afternoon. My name is Tracy Murray Moore. I'm the Chief Human Resource Officer for the Reinvestment Fund, a community development financial institution with locations in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Atlanta. I've been in HR for 20 years, and I am very interested in bringing the human back to human resources, especially in light of all that we've been through the last few years with the pandemic. But at the Reinvestment Fund, my responsibility is for developing and executing the HR strategy in support of the organization's goals. And I'm responsible for developing and executing some, in the areas of talent management, training, recruiting, compensation. This topic for me around multi-generational dynamics has been close to my heart for at least 8 years. In 2015, I was able to present on this topic to a local college who was really grappling with the dynamics of 4 generations at that time. And it really was an opportunity for me to invoke more of an awareness around, meeting people where they were, and, the interest in developing relationships. I am a proud Gen Xer. I value work. I'm independent minded. I prefer to talk about diversity, technology, and I say that I'm proud because I'm in the mix, right, of between a traditionalist and a Gen Xer. I was very influenced by my grandparents who were traditionalists. They were dedicated, they worked really hard, they respected authority, they paid their dues. And so me growing up watching how they adapted to work really influenced me. So I say that while there are distinctions amongst the generations, the line is very blurred at times because we are a product of our experiences, right? More so maybe than the age that we are. And so I show up very much as a traditionalist, really sometimes adapting my style to appease the organization or those that I'm talking to. And I am definitely dedicated and hardworking, but I love that independent space as well. So those are my definitions of who I am.
Well, thanks, Marcy and Emmy and Tracy. I'm going to take a stab at doing the same. So I'm Stacy Grant. This is my second real job ever, is working for LISC. So I've been here for almost 30 years, working kind of my way up through the organization. identifying definitely as a proud Gen Xer, as you said, Tracy. But also, I think, as Marcy, you said, I'm kind of cherry picking some of the things I like the best about all of the other generations as well. And in my role as the AmeriCorps director, I get the opportunity every day to work with people who are of all generations in the workforce, including those who are coming into the workforce, to hear their opinions, hear what they think about work. So I will say that, you know, the Gen Zers have really changed my mind about what it means to be direct in the space. Millennials, you've also taught me a little bit about what it means to have student loan debt and what that looks like in the space of where I was as a Gen Xer coming up through this. You know, I cherry pick pronouns to put on as my identifier from Gen Z, and from the silent generation and or the boomers, I look at, I want change to happen now, just as much as anybody else does too. And so while that may seem to be a little, you know, like, hey, you're picking different things from the different generations. And we started off saying we didn't want to stereotype generations. I was wondering if, Marcy, now that we kind of have an understanding of who we all are here, can you talk to us a little bit about what generations mean in this space, and why should we be caring about it?
Yeah, a few thoughts come to mind. One is, you know, a lot of us say, you know, it shouldn't matter what generation you are, if we're all working towards the same thing, you know, we should be able to coexist quite naturally. And I don't usually put too much stock in thinking that what generation you are, what age you are, is going to kind of affect whether you're a good team member, whether you are easy to work with, hard to work with, any of those kinds of things. But the generations matter in the way that when you came of age and what was going on in the world around you does have relevance, right? It does have relevance if you were in high school during the pandemic and your education became all virtual and you lived through this thing that everybody else of your generation lived through at that time. You know, did you grow up with you know, constant access to technology or social media? Did you? So those kinds of like external landscape things they matter and they shape us, and they're just part of our consciousness, just like, you know, what media we consumed or other kinds of things. And I think when it comes to, so it's important to understand those things, and those things could actually help us in trying to think about how to reach different groups. So, you know, when you're trying to, you know, we do a lot of narrative work and a lot of media work. And if we only think about the media that one generation consumes, we are only going to be talking to one media. You obviously talk about recruiting for AmeriCorps. You could be recruiting on college campuses. You could be recruiting in other places that young adults congregate. If you want to be recruiting older people, you would probably go through different media channels and different places where older people congregate, or media that older people consume. So I think these things are important in terms of the tactics we use to do the work we do. And then I think there's also what kind of culture, how are we making a culture feel inclusive to everyone? And how do we all feel a sense of belonging at the places where we work? And, you know, I'm interested, Tracy, in your perspective, because I think of age as just another diversity lever as we have the whole DEI conversation. And just as we want to make sure people of all different kinds of backgrounds, people who have accessibility needs, people of different genders have different, you know, needs at work, it is interesting to think about how are you making your workplace feel like a place of belonging and inclusion for people of all ages.
Yeah, I was going to add to how this conversation really matters. It matters in how we recruit. It matters in how we communicate. It matters in how we engage and onboard. It matters so much in how we, build relationships. And so for me, from an HR perspective, I've had to really think about, engaging people, onboarding people, helping them to feel a part of our organization, and culture to cultivate a welcoming and engaging culture, and that has become much more prevalent now because, we're in hybrid mode. But really, asking people, how do we give you a sense of belonging? We cannot make assumptions around what people need. We have to ask the question, and we have to be curious about that, because we need to understand that, what drives and motivates people. Communication is another reason why this conversation matters. We talked about technology. So I typically, when I form a relationship, I ask people, how do you want me to communicate with you? What is your preference? Is it, via email or via Teams? I just actually had this conversation with my team the other day. Like, what form of communication really is most impactful to you? And then, creating opportunities for those conversations to exist. We created a water cooler just for informal conversations, and people can post pictures of their families and their pets. Like, that was another way in which we tried to, engage, everyone in the organization, depending, it didn't matter what generation they were, just, pulling people in. And then around onboarding, I thought it was important for people to understand what other departments are charged with doing, and people. And so I created an immersion plan specifically for new hires to have conversations with internal stakeholders, not time bound. It was just, so you work in programs, tell me about programs. I want people to be curious about the organization and what we do, and not be niched and siloed in their thinking. And so that's across all generations, that people have a need for awareness, a sense of belonging, a sense of awareness. And so some of those things are, at constant play at Reinvestment Fund, but I'm very excited about people having that level of attachment earlier on. And that, again, runs the gamut. Doesn't matter what generation you are. And because we've had people who are in the organization for 20, 30 years, and they too are, trying to, understand what momentums are going on in the organization. And so we are gauging them as well. So it's really a fluid relationship building and awareness.
That sounds great, Tracy. I love the idea of the water cooler, and I might have to borrow that. And it makes me, it really does. And I know it's a commercial. I'm not sure if it's one, but age really is just a number in this space, right? It's the number that's on your driver's license. It's not how you're showing up in the office. And just by kind of looking at our backgrounds, it looks like, Emmy, you are in an office setting. So how is this generational conversation playing out? I mean, even pre-COVID, post-COVID, as you're taking on even a new role as the executive director. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think there's a lot of wonderful things at play for me all at the same time, in which I'm relatively new to the role, relatively young, or younger than a lot of our staff. And I think that we have been back in the office for about a year now, and it's sort of increasing because we are client facing, and sort of redefining what it means for hybrid at LEDC has been one of the questions that we've had. But I think it's been very helpful since we've come back into the office for people to sort of start finding ways of organically interacting more. It's been sort of employees that have led the initiative of having like book club and an outdoors club and these types of things. And it's not things that leadership imposed, or I tried to do a staff hike, but it was a little, we're not all at the same level of physical capabilities. And so it was one of those things. It's like, no, I rather staff decide which activities they'd like for us to support. And our role as leaders is really to support them, whether that be monetarily, buying the books for their book club or those types of things. I think redefining how we're able to support them in that way has been very helpful. But I think that one of the things, to Tracy's point earlier about incorporating employee feedback, is that everyone likes to give their feedback in a different way. Some people prefer an anonymous survey. Some people like to do it on a staff call or put it in the chat, but they want sort of an audience there when they're providing that feedback because they want to see, do others agree with me, or what are their reactions to my thoughts? And others prefer that one-on-one time, right? They like to come into my office, do you have 5 minutes, and share that feedback. And I think one of the important things when we talk about multi-generational feedback and that type of thing is to ensure that we're incorporating all of that and not making assumptions that we're all on the same page, because we all have different priorities and values. And the reality is that those also change throughout time, right? When we were looking at our benefits package for the new fiscal year next year, we were very interested in leadership and increasing our 401k match slightly, and other staff members were wanted us to prioritize our contribution to their health plans, right? And those were, and sometimes generationally aligned, but it was really interesting to see that we can't make that assumption that we all prioritize our 401k or that type of thing. Because somebody who's 21 is like, that's not in my radar right now. I much more prefer to pay less on my healthcare premiums, right? And so that type of thing is something that only arises when you ensure that you have that diversity of opinion across age as well, and not just sort of other things that we tend to think about. And another sort of example is when we were talking about professional development, it's always been a requirement that people's professional development align to their role. And as the increase of people that left the corporate sector and joined the CDFI nonprofit world, it was people who are not interested in another career path. They wanted to focus on mission-based work, and really what they would like their professional development to do is explore other curiosities, photography, or these other kind of things, which I think add a great value to their quality of life as well, which keeps them happy and supported and shows that as an organization, we care more than just sort of their work balance, but want them to be fulfilled in other ways as well. So we took away the requirement that it be job aligned and that it just be something that they're interested in doing. And those are the kinds of things that really never crossed my mind until those conversations with those employees are like, Emmy, have you thought about this requirement sort of preventing us from doing this other thing that would contribute to us? And so I think in that vein, it's been sort of really interesting to learn that over the last year, and also receive input from staff on how we receive input, I think has been very important to us.
I love those ideas, Emmy. Just the idea that we can be flexible, be adaptable, and sort of take that feedback from our employees to say, how can we meet you where you're at, and what speaks to you and your onlyness or your oneness in that space. And, it piggybacks on Tracy's, like, we're curious. Let's be curious about who you are so that we get to know you. I love that. We may have to bring some of those up at our organization too. So, but Marcy, I want to go back to you and CoGenerate for a moment. And at LISC, we've enjoyed working with CoGenerate on sort of this co-generational modeling space in the world of national service, and what it means to kind of build a talent development pipeline. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about that co-generational model and how the different generations can learn from one another, and sort of what you're seeing from the research and practicality in that space.
Sure. So we've done recent research with University of Chicago, and what has been so interesting in this research is that older and younger people have a very strong desire to work on problems together. So that dispels this notion that there's some kind of generational tension, but the majority of people actually find obstacles to working together. And the biggest obstacle is proximity. And we see that in national service, right? That often there could be an AmeriCorps program, for example, and a Senior Corps program working in the same community on the same kinds of issues, be it, hunger or housing or whatever the issues are, and often not necessarily cooperating together or sharing resources. So we're trying to work at a systems level to break down some of those barriers wherever we can. So we like to say like purpose and proximity are really great ingredients for older and younger people being adjacent and then have something like a shared purpose to work on something together. Just like, it's very similar to the way work friendships happen. We all know that, there's lots of research that shows that one of the biggest indicators of happiness at work is having a good friend at work. But one of the biggest contributors to having a good friend is just like regularity of seeing someone. It is why it's so important to like share lunch with somebody or, take that middle of the day walk with someone. So we believe that service is one of the most natural ways to start doing that. And often when older or younger people are trying to figure out how to form a relationship, working on a service project is a really natural way to do it, which is why we think that's such a great sandbox to play in. So, we think it's one of the more promising areas to make the case for cogeneration.
I'll build on that too, Marcy. I think that we've learned that hierarchy doesn't really matter to some of our generations, right? And while they may respect the institutional knowledge, they're also change agents, right? And so what we've done to kind of eliminate some of those silos in our work environment is create work teams and work, so you're deployed to work on a specific initiative, and you are given the opportunity to work with people you never have an opportunity to work with. So different departments, different areas of discipline, right? And different ages and tenure in the organization. And so it has been hugely effective, not only in building up like the bench strength of the folks on those work teams, but building relationships as well. And breaking silos as well. And it's been hugely, important for me because I want people to see themselves at Reinvestment Fund, not just in the role that they're currently in, but opportunities to expand their knowledge and create a development plan for themselves, right? We're so small, we don't have right now the bandwidth to do job rotations, but we certainly can give folks the opportunity to learn a new skill or new language working on project teams. We just finished our strategic plan, and we had work teams who really influenced the action planning around that. And so it's really exciting. We included our board as well. So staff had the opportunity to engage with the board members, again, dispelling the hierarchy piece. So I see more of that, I think, going forward from an HR perspective, or organization perspective, that there will be a demand for cross-departmental teams and work groups, and I'm excited about it.
That sounds great, Tracy. I mean, I love the idea that people are getting to be not only asked, but also self-selecting into teams that they want to be working on, and that it's not just about the people, but also about the projects that are happening, and that you're really attracting your talent internally to the work that needs to be done, which then has that sort of motivating factor, right, to want to do your best work. And so that's really exciting to be hearing about that. I was wondering, maybe, Emmy, if you could build upon a little bit about what Tracy was talking about in that space, and sort of how, as leaders, are we showing up to sort of encapsulate all of that? What does that look like on the ground for LEDC and for Emmy in this role? How are you bridging and straddling all of those generations in your workforce, and the work and the.
I think it's understanding that we all have so many things going on, and we all, right, accepting the impact that COVID has had on many of us, and how many lives have been changed very drastically, right? At the onset of the pandemic, our organization was about 36 employees. And really, our organization is primarily Latino serving, as well as Latino staff. We're about 90% Latino staff. And at the onset of the pandemic, within the first 4 months, we had 7 employees lose parents to COVID. And so that was a very huge impact that continues through us now, right? And that was very life-changing. And so when we talk about and that impacted people of every generation, right? It was, and impacted all of us very deeply, and to really analyze, like, how do we show up for each other? And one of the main things for me is sort of setting that example, right? So talking about mental health and talking about exercise and sort of the different things outside of work that I was doing. I remember a couple of months into the pandemic, I wasn't executive director yet, but someone on a staff meeting said, I want to hear from leadership how you're balancing work life and how you're handling this. And I was like, I think we're the worst ones. Like, we are not the people to ask about this, because just looking at the leadership team at the time, we were managing PPP loans, which CDFIs could only get into from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. So I'm like, work-life balance. I'm like, I have a second part-time job in the middle of the night. And so, those were but it really forced us as a leadership to sort of analyze, we should be setting the example, right, in this realm. We shouldn't be the ones going, the only ones, or feeling like we have to do so much more, when the reality is that we are also part of the staff, right? Like, and they see that, and they model after that. And I think that's something that impacted not just our younger staff as we grew, right? So I said we started at 36 employees, we're now at 95. And that 95 is comprised of people that did a complete career change, as well as people who this is their very first job. And I think that it's really interesting to see that dynamic play out when we talk about, Marcy was talking about the environment, right? Like, the recession, I was in college during the last one, so I didn't see that impact on the day-to-day in my rural college in Vermont, right? And we have employees who don't fully understand what inflation or recession means, right? And then we have some who have been through multiple recessions. And so it is interesting to see their input when we talk about planning and preserving the sustainability of the organization and things like that, to have that input, because it's very important to our programming. It's very important to how we decide our staffing and what kind of initiatives we want to go after for our staff, as well as the clients that we serve. And in that regard, I really appreciate that impact because it is one thing when we look at the media and we read these things, I'm like, oh my God, like, the recession's coming. It's like, well, no, like, nonprofits tend to do all right sometimes. And that type of feedback is very interesting to receive, or very important, and calms my nerves sometimes when thinking about how do we ensure the sustainability of the organization and things like that. So I appreciate that, but it's important to create those avenues in which they can share their stories of, like, listen, during the last recession, the organization actually grew and we were able to do this or that type of thing. So the institutional knowledge that comes with staff that has been at the organization longer is something that I think is very important to value as well, and shows the staff the importance of continuity and how okay that is as well, right? It is also one of those things that when we make assumptions, right, that Gen Z wants to go from job to job every 2 years and things like that, really, that's only, I think, if they aren't feeling fulfilled. I think feeling fulfilled is something important, not just to Gen Z, but I think they're more vocal about it. But it's something that if we incorporate with what does that really mean, I think we'll start to break that stereotype or assumption that they're only here for 2 years. In some ways, I think it's a lazy excuse to not invest in the future of your staff if you think they're only going to be there for a year or two. And it's like, no, we can't let ourselves off the hook. Like, if you really think that they should be here a long time, you have to invest in them and invest in their life outside of just work and things like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. I think the pandemic really reshaped a lot of organizations and their people strategy. I know for us, we invited people into our homes for the first time. I think we had relationships that were formed, but you got to see, people's children, and really show up as a leader with some empathy. And so I created some norms when we departed the building, so to speak. And the first one was, to my leadership team, like lead with empathy. And the other norm was silence doesn't necessarily mean everything is okay. And so for me, it was really encouraging people in the organization to lean in to their colleagues a bit more, regardless of what role they played in the organization, because people were struggling, and it didn't matter how long people had been in the organization or what have you. We were encouraging people to lean into folks and ask how folks were doing. Mental health was a really big program that I was pushing, as well as financial wellness. We talked about, tying people in, like people were at different life stages, right? And so their financial needs were changing. So, I introduced financial wellness seminars to staff, and so people can speak with a financial advisor. So we have our millennials who are focused on college debt, and then we have, folks who are about to retire. So it is really about establishing programs or initiatives that meet our employee population, but we have to listen. We have to ask the question to understand what would be most impactful. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you for that, Tracy. And I think, even just listening to you as you were describing it, right, that there's a lot that as leaders, as Emmy, you were saying as well, we're holding an awful lot of responsibility to not only make sure that we and our families are okay, but also the families of the staff are okay as well as our staff is. And so you can hear that come through in your messaging, both of you, very loud, very clearly. So we have a couple minutes left before we go to live Q&A. What do we do now? We have all of these things. What's one thing that each of you could say to our colleagues who are joining us today? Here's a place where you could start. And so I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it and share my one thought of where we can start, which is we can start by learning and listening from everyone, regardless of what generation they identify with. One of my latest learnings is with someone who would most definitely say she identifies as a Gen Z. And she said, sometimes as CDFIs, we have to decide whether or not we're a CD or we're an FI. And how do we balance that? How do we balance the community development with the financial institution aspect? And I think that's a line that we all walk sometimes in this space. So, Marcy, where do we start? What's
Okay,
one thing we can do today?
I'm going to start with something that sounds big, but it has smaller applications. So our organization made a big decision this year, and we adopted a co-leadership model. We have 2 CEOs, and they are intentionally generationally diverse. So we call it co-generational co-leadership. So of course, that is something you can do at the executive director level or CEO level, and it's a really good way to work on sustainability, to work on executive director burnout, all of the things. It's a very solitary, hard job, but I think this model of shared leadership could happen in all kinds of places. It could happen in a role. It can happen on a team or a committee where you have, co-generational chairs of a committee or so. It's a very interesting idea to experiment with in any environment where you think it might work.
I'll go. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we all want to coexist, right? We want to be able to bring our best selves and show up that way. And I think that we should dispel, the us against them generational mindset, since we're all in this together, right? We all signed up, we aligned ourselves behind the mission. And so I would, I really want people to focus on developing relationships, really remain curious about people, and create an environment where all generations benefit in the organization and profit from an improved culture. I mean, that's really my heart of heart right there.
Yeah, I support both. And I think for me, the next thing is that if you're not currently thinking about age, when you think about the inclusivity work at your organization, that it be one. And then that when you are making decisions on the organization or the strategic planning process, I know many CDFIs are working on that as we all come from out of COVID, figuring out what does the next 3 years look like, is to incorporate those kinds of thoughts into the lens of how you make every decision going forward when it comes to the programming as well as benefits and that type of thing. It needs to be one of the lens that's used by making those decisions and evaluating what to pursue.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way to spend my morning/afternoon than with the three of you most amazing humans. Thank you so much for being a part of this session, for bringing your time, your talents, your grace, and your understanding to help us all make a difference in the work that we're going to do going forward. So just thank you for sharing your insights, your expertise, and to everyone on the phone today or in the Zoom room, thank you for joining our session today. If you are watching this live, I do hope that you will join us in the interactive Zoom room for the question and answer and further conversation that we're going to hold. You can access that Zoom room by clicking the link, join the interactive discussion group link, which is at the bottom of this page below the session description. And just give us a minute as the four of us to switch over into that interactive room. But if you decide that you don't want to join us, I do hope that you'll be back for the closing plenary at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. So hopefully we'll see you there and we'll talk soon. Bye.